And so talking about amazing women, I am now going to introduce Ms. Chenai Mukumba, who is the dynamic executive director at the Tax Justice Network Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya, although she's Zimbabwean, but we've adopted her. She provides strategic leadership across TGNA's diverse thematic areas, driving the organization's mission and vision. With a master's degree in international relations from WITS and taxation from the University of Oxford, Chenai brings a formidable academic background to her role. As a prominent female voice, we're particularly proud to have such an accomplished young woman at the helm of Africa's premier tax organization, leading in a field often dominated by established male figures. I say young with a caveat. Space young is anything 40 and up, and maybe we need to begin to change that. I welcome Chenai. I won't take any more time because I sent her the questions, so I won't repeat it, but welcome.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I consider myself young, but I think this space has interesting definitions when it comes to age. Thank you so much, Aphrodite, I think, for creating this platform and giving us an opportunity to speak on, I think, as Professor Bobkin just mentioned, this paper that we, as the Stop the Bleeding campaign, want to use as the basis for work moving forward. As was mentioned, this paper is entitled the Black Paper, and really this is a pushback against the normal papers that are often referred to as white papers. We want to reclaim the space, this language, and really give it a Pan-African identity. So what I was asked to speak on was really about some of the systemic and structural reform that we're starting to see within the global financial architecture space. One of the points that was raised earlier in the presentation was that one of the issues we need to seriously consider tackling as a continent is the scourge of illicit financial flows, because this is particularly significantly affecting the way in which we interact within the global financial architecture, and also contributing to the current debt burden that we see ourselves confronted with as a continent. One of the things that I often say whenever I'm asked to speak about illicit financial flows is that for me it is such a frustrating conversation, because the estimates that we currently have in terms of how much we're losing, and these are very conservative estimates, right, put us at losing around $90 billion. But when you think about how much we are receiving, both in foreign direct investment as well as overseas development assistance, to borrow the words of Professor, the water really is flowing upwards, because we receive in foreign direct investment $54 billion, which means we're losing double the amount of money that we go around begging for, right, to invest within the continent. In terms of overseas development, these figures are estimated to be about $40 billion. Again, most of you will recall the amount of outcry we had when USAID essentially decided to close their taps. But when you compare that, again, to the amount of money that we lose as a continent, it's really minuscule. So for me, one of the things that I often say is that people talk about this continent being rich in mineral wealth, being rich in resources, having a young population. But even before that, quite frankly, we are also rich in financial resources. At some point, all of these resources actually exist on the continent, but then they're finding themselves funneled out. So even before we have conversations about increasing tax rates or expanding the tax base, we at one point or the other have these resources on the continent. And so we need to be having a meaningful conversation about how do we retain those resources. And the discussion on the reform of the global financial architecture is such an important piece. So I've been asked to speak a little bit about what's happening within the global financial architecture that's being spearheaded by the tax justice movement. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes really speaking to that. One of the things that we've been discussing over the past few days, for those of you who are also here for the sort of young scholars sort of session that Aphrodite and Ideas was having, is this concept that when we talk about reparations, yes, it is about fixing the historical injustices, but over and above that, it's also about correcting the systemic and structural conditions that continue to perpetuate inequality and injustice today. And so right now, what's happening and what's being led by the tax justice movement is this conversation about reforming the global tax system, because embedded within the rules that underpin that are systems that continue to perpetuate inequality between states, but also between peoples. So when you think about the current body that governs the global tax system, and this is really borrowing for those of you who heard Dereje's remarks yesterday, it's currently being overseen by the OECD. Now, the OECD took over this role in the 1960s, and in the 1960s, many of our countries at that point were really just fighting for political independence, right? And so since the 1960s, this group of rich countries has dominated global tax conversations. And as you can imagine, we have currently, therefore, a global tax system that is skewed in favor of the countries that were at the table, right, when these rules were being made. Also, the countries that continue to make these rules are the same countries that got together in the 1960s to do this work. So in 2020, there was what at that point felt like a really small development, but Nigeria tabled a proposal for the UN to start having conversations on how to promote an effective and inclusive international tax system. So at the time, there wasn't really much thought about it. So the paper passed and was adopted as Resolution 77-244. But what this resolution did was begin the first ever conversation that includes every single country on how to think through the global tax system. Now, the reason this is so important is because, and I completely agree with Eunice, there are so many conversations we need to have about what we need to reform domestically, right, to address the loss of resources that we have. But we also need to be thinking about how you reform the global tax system, how you reform the global financial architecture. Often as civil society, we are almost reprimanded for being lofty, right, and not thinking through sort of practical solutions, right, when thinking about structural reform, etc. But this particular conversation that's happening at the UN is exactly that. It's an example of how you can have a conversation about systemic and structural reform that has very, very practical ways of doing that. So over the past few years, there's been conversations where different countries are coming together with regards to how do we reform this global tax system? What are some of the measures that need to be put in place to make it more equitable, to make it more fair? So right now, I remember, not right now, but a few years ago, I remember sitting in one of those conversations before the negotiations had actually begun. And I remember within that conversation, it was the Deputy Commissioner General of Lesotho who raised his flag right at the beginning of the discussions. And one of the things he said is that, you know, I never thought that as a country, I would have the ability to contribute to these discussions, knowing that my vote would count as much as anybody's, right? Regardless of the size of my economy, right? And literally, we have seen that playing throughout the negotiations over the past few years. What was particularly significant was that at the beginning of this year, when they were talking through what is this framework convention going to look like? What are these protocols going to exist? In the afternoon of the first day, the United States raised their flag and said, you know, in light of current discussions internally, we're no longer going to be participating in these conversations because they don't align with our national interest. And they walked out. You know what happened? Nothing. The conversations continued because within that platform, every single country that's sitting in those negotiations has one vote, regardless of your size, regardless of how much weight you have within the global financial architecture. And so I point to this as an example because whilst the conversation, of course, is getting more technical and there's various contributions that need to come from various stakeholders, it really, for me, provides an example of the kind of reform that is possible when we all come together. I didn't mention this, but the group of countries that is spearheading this change is the Africa group, the most unexpected group to be pushing forward this type of conversation within the United Nations. And there's so much pushback, significant pushback, but having worked with some of these negotiators, they are committed to see how they can actually contribute to what we talk about all the time in conversations like this. And I think what's incredible is that it's almost started the snowball effect, because similarly, there is another conversation that's also on the cusp beginning with regards to how can we have this type of discussion within the debt movement. And so AfroDebt is working with colleagues within the negotiation space to push something like that forward. So for us, as part of the Stop the Bleeding campaign, we're so excited to be engaged in conversations like this, where we're actually able to practicalize the conversations that are happening within this room. And so I think for me, really it's to say there is movement that's happening. There really is an opportunity that is presenting itself for us to genuinely influence these global conversations, even as we are looking internally with regards to domestic reforms as well. And it's incredibly exciting. And so I invite all of you to join us as we do this work to literally stop the bleeding of the resources that are leaving our continent. Thank you.